Not a complete grand slam home run here for the prosecutors, but guilty on 8 counts. Significant blow to Paul Manafort and President Trump.
It is a significant development, obviously, for Special Counsel Robert Mueller. This is the first test before a jury of his investigation, and it is a partial success on those tax crimes that Paul Manafort has just been found guilty of, and a bank fraud and the failure to file ownership of a foreign bank account or foreign asset. But this is also the power of the jury system. They were given a very dense, very difficult document-driven case. They sorted through it. They came to an agreement on the prosecution's strongest case. I've talked to defense lawyers who did think that those tax crimes, they were pretty strong cases for the prosecution. These other ones, though, the jury threw out. So how much of an impact this has politically, it probably does strengthen Special Counsel Robert Mueller's hand. He does have a victory, but it also shows that the jury just, in this case, shut all that out, and they went methodically through the evidence. They came to the agreements they could and punted on the rest.
And, of course, Paul Manafort also now faces a second trial in Washington, D.C. on several charges, including lying to the FBI, conspiracy to defraud the United States, witness tampering. So he is facing even more legal trouble going forward. We want to bring in Chris Christie, who also worked with President Trump on that campaign as an outside advisor after Paul Manafort was chairman. Chris Christie, none of these charges have anything to do with his campaign work for President Trump, Paul Manafort's campaign work for President Trump. But President Trump has recently, as Friday, called out this investigation, called out this trial, and called Paul Manafort a good man.
Yeah, well, listen, George, I think one, this part of it has never involved a campaign. But I think the important thing is this is a mixed bag for this special counsel. Because if you look at the counts, at least as far as I can tell right now, that wound up to be a guilty verdict, they had very little to do with Rick Gates. And the ones that the jury hung on seem to be the ones that were much more dependent upon Gates' testimony.
We should explain who Rick Gates is. He was the former deputy campaign chair, longtime colleague of Paul Manafort, who was originally charged with Paul Manafort, but then took a plea and was the cooperating witness against him.
And he was the main verbal witness, non-document witness. Now, this has real implications for the next trial, because the next trial, I think, will be much more dependent upon Rick Gates than even this first trial was, George. And so, I think if you're in the Mueller team, you're happy. This is a win. This is a win and justifies your prosecution. But I think you're going to have to take
that may be true, Chris, but let me interrupt you right there, because the Mueller's team is saying they have far more documents for that second trial than they even had for this first trial.
They may, George, but when you look at the allegations in the second trial, it will also be to really sell that to a jury. They're going to need Gates to be a narrator, we call it in the business, to narrate them through that in addition to the FBI agents. And so I just think that it's going to be a time where Mueller is going to look back on how they tried this case, how well they prepared Gates, and what kind of witness Gates is as he gets ready for trial number 2.
And we're seeing Rick Gates there behind Paul Manafort there on the screen. He's the man in the circle right there. Another question on this, Chris Christie. One of the big questions is, was this all an attempt to pressure Paul Manafort to give information on President Trump? He's withstood that so far. Does this give another opening to prosecutors, or is that just gone?
Listen, there's always an opportunity to do it when you've got a second trial that you're getting ready for and more charges for him to face. And now he has the certainty of facing some jail time. And so now it's all in a even more complete context for Manafort. But I would tell you, George, I think if he hasn't cooperated at this point, he's probably not going to. And that could mean one of two things. Either he doesn't care to cooperate or he's got nothing to cooperate with.
And Pierre Thomas, senior justice correspondent, before we go, 10 counts, a mistrial on 10 counts. Prosecutors will also now face the choice of whether to try to retry on those charges.
George, I think one of the things we have to factor in is, aside from the politics, there's the human nature of this. Paul Manafort is currently in jail on allegations of witness tampering. With these 8 convictions, he's facing years in jail. Years in jail. That's what the situation is for him. He won't be out in the public for any time soon. And again, he's got another trial ahead of him, but he's now looking at convictions that would land him in jail for years.
And Cecilia Vega at the White House, as I said, Cecilia, the president called Paul Manafort a good man on Friday as he was speaking out against the Mueller investigation. But the White House has had conflicting things to say about Paul Manafort as well. At first, they tried to push him off as someone who didn't have a great deal to do with the campaign, even though he was the campaign chair.
Yeah, they tried to paint him as a two-bit player, a small player in the campaign. And you're right, he rose to the rank of campaign manager and really was the person who coordinated the Republican National Convention for this team. He was not a two-bit player. And as we've been saying, the Russia investigation, Trump himself was not a part of this trial. But make no mistake about this, George, indirectly, this White House is very much linked to Paul Manafort and this trial that is just taking place right now. Surprisingly, or perhaps not, we have not heard any comment from President Trump himself. We have not heard a comment from the White House. We have yet to hear a comment directly from anyone affiliated with the campaign. We were going to attempt to ask the president questions about this, about the Michael Cohen deal today, and instead they canceled his departure on the South Lawn here at the White House, the only opportunity where reporters like myself would have been allowed to ask the president questions today. They said that there was bad weather. I don't know if you can see behind me here, George, the skies are pretty sunny at this point. So no questions for the president on this one just yet.
As I said, a day of bombshell developments in the legal matters surrounding President Trump and his campaign. His former campaign chair, Paul Manafort, found guilty on 8 counts of tax evasion, failing to file foreign bank accounts, and bank fraud and bank conspiracy. Mistrial on 10 other counts. Open question whether prosecutors are going to continue to pursue that. Of course, Paul Manafort does face a second trial in Washington, D.C. on a host of charges as well. And as I said, this comes on the day when the president's former personal attorney, Michael Cohen, has pled guilty. He's in a courthouse now in the Southern District of New York, pleading guilty to charges of campaign finance violations dealing with the 2016 campaign, also tax evasion and bank fraud. We're expecting to hear from the assistant U.S. attorney who's prosecuting that case, Robert Khuzami, shortly. We'll be back on the air when that comes. And, of course, a full report tonight on World News Tonight with David Muir.
This has been a special report from ABC News.
The jury could not reach a verdict on 10 of those counts, so the judge will be declaring a mistrial on those 10 counts. It will be up to prosecutors if they want to retry him. But again, Paul Manafort, President Trump's former campaign chair, found guilty on 8 counts in this case. Devin Dwyer, our coordinating producer, is standing by for us in D.C. And Devin, how significant is this, given there was no actual relation between this and the Trump campaign or the Russia probe, but this being Robert Mueller's first case?
Well, as you heard from our team over at the courthouse, that this was a very significant moment for Robert Mueller. The first test is sort of a vindication of his legal efforts to go after President Trump's team here, corruption, if you will, around the campaign. But President Trump's supporters, the White House, though they haven't weighed in officially yet, would say, look, this is a sign that they have nothing on the president, that the fact that they have now convicted Paul Manafort on these tax charges, fraud charges, none of that happened, connected to the campaign, as you say. But what was fascinating in this trial was that it was taking place during the time he was leading the Trump campaign. Paul Manafort did not file tax returns. He did not report these accounts while he was there in the mix in the late days of 2016. So very close to the president here, sort of a surreal afternoon, Diane, in addition to what's going on with Michael Cohen, that this has hit so close to President Trump.
Yeah, quite a big day in terms of court proceedings related to the president. Devin, I want to bring in Pierre Thomas. He's there at the courthouse. And Pierre, what do we know so far about these counts on which Manafort was found guilty?
Well, again, 8 counts he's found guilty. He's facing likely years in jail. Tax evasion charges, there were 5 counts of that. There was a failure to file a foreign bank account on another charge, and there was a bank fraud charge and a conspiracy charge. So, again, you have to put in perspective that he's already in jail being held in connection with witness tampering, allegations of witness tampering. So this was, while it was a mixed verdict, it clearly is a very difficult day for Manafort and his family. The man is going to face, again, years in jail, and he's another trial coming up in regard to whether he was acting illegally as a foreign agent on the behalf of the Ukrainian officials. So, again, difficult day for the Manafort team and his family, but in terms of the politics, there were 10 counts. which the jury could not come to a unanimous verdict on, and the judge declared a mistrial on those 10 counts.
And Pierre, any sort of inclination of how this case might affect that other case that Manafort has ahead of him?
Well, again, they're separate cases, but they're also being held and tried by the special counsel. So from their standpoint, the fact that they got convictions in which this man will be facing jail time, he's now a convicted felon, if you will. So from that standpoint, it gives legitimacy to their investigation. But again, there will be politics involved where some people will say, well, you didn't get a slam dunk because you didn't get all the charges, convictions on all the charges. But again, in practical terms, for the man who is facing 18 counts, he's now looking at jail time in the course of years.
All right, Pierre Thomas Forrest there in Alexandria, Virginia. Pierre, thank you. I want to go over to Kate Shaw, ABC News consultant. Kate, we heard Pierre talking about the political ramifications of being found guilty on 8 counts but getting a hung jury on the other 10. What are the legal ramifications of all of this?
Well, I mean, so Pierre's talking about the possibility of jail time, and of course now, we're looking at there could be decades in terms of a sentence that could attach to the convictions on the 8 counts the jury did convict on. But an additional legal question that has to be swirling around the White House and the president's advisors right now is the question of pardons, right? The president has the unilateral power to pardon. He could pardon Paul Manafort today if he wanted to. You could pardon for conduct that hasn't been tried or convicted yet. So that the pardons could extend even to the kinds of things that haven't yet been trialed in the D.C. case that's scheduled for September. I think there have to be a lot of conversations ongoing right now about whether the use of that kind of unilateral power, and you see with these security clearance strippings or the single security clearance stripping that the president is flexing his muscles in terms of some of this unilateral presidential power. So I imagine he at least is thinking about that.
And Kate, in terms of the relation to the campaign, this wasn't a direct tie-in with the Russia investigation. It was Robert Mueller's first case. But it sounds like some of this was going on while Paul Manafort was working for the campaign. Could the campaign somehow get dragged into this now?
I think there are a couple of possible linkages. One is the kind of timing connection, right? Some of this conduct was ongoing while Paul Manafort was connected to the campaign. So there's that linkage. And then there actually is the linkage not just to the campaign, but to the Russia probe, at least in general terms, in that, the funds that were being hidden in banks and that weren't then being reported, that were the subject of the tax fraud claims that the jury did convict on, the source of all those funds, or many of them, were Ukrainian clients of Paul Manafort's, many of which were Russian affiliated. So there's a connection to Russia sort of that lays behind a lot of the conduct that's at issue here. So both Russia and the campaign are in the background, even though none of those things are squarely at issue in terms of the conduct that was charged and on which the jury convicted.
Now, from the perspective of the Trump campaign, if there is something to worry about, do you find the fact that he hasn't cooperated with prosecutors until this point, is that reassuring? Does that sort of mean he either doesn't want to or doesn't have anything? Or could he now go forward and still cooperate in the future with this next case?
He absolutely could, and I think stranger things have happened, but I would be very surprised, having sort of withstood the pressure to cooperate, even facing the amount of jail time that he is facing. To this point, it doesn't seem that likely to me that he's going to reverse course now. I think far more likely he's holding out the hope that he gets a complete pardon and never has to do any jail time at all.
And now he's looking at jail time, it sounds like, with these 8 counts at least. He's already been in jail on this witness tampering issue, and it will be until he serves in that next case. So what are the potential that we're looking at in terms of how much time Paul Manafort could get here?
It looks like decades. I mean, the total in terms of the 18 counts, it looked like he was facing something like 300 years of aggregate jail time. And I think in terms of the 8 that we've seen that the convictions are on, it looks like up to 80 years. So, functionally that would be life in prison. Of course, that's the outside limit, and a sentencing judge would by no means be obligated to give that kind of maximum sentence. But it's essentially life in prison that could be on the table.
Is there any way for Paul Manafort to sort of make things better for himself at this point?
Well, look, he could choose to cooperate, and then, of course, to the extent that he had useful information to provide to the prosecutors, the possibility of a reduced prison sentence would very much be kind of on the table. Or, he can make it clear to the president and his team that he's interested in a pardon. But I would say that those are, at this point, look, he could appeal these, point to some errors in terms of these proceedings, and obviously he's got a legal team that I imagine would be able to continue fighting. But obviously this is a tough day for him and his family.
And in terms of the ramifications and a potential, this potentially affecting, the White House, the president, one of the star witnesses, or the star witness in this case, was Rick Gates, who worked side by side with Manafort for many years, both in his businesses but also in the campaign itself. Could Gates pose a problem for the president?
It is interesting that it seems as though Gates' testimony was not as effective as the prosecutors had hoped. And, he was subject to tough cross-examination over the course of a couple of days. Now, we don't know what a hung jury means, right? It could have been that most of the jurors wanted to convict even on the counts that were so reliant on Gates' testimony. But there were a couple who, believed that the defense was essentially successful in undermining his credibility. So I think that all of that, it's hard to know. All we know is that the jurors could not reach unanimous verdicts to convict on those counts. But, it seems as though probably he's provided all the useful information he had to provide as to the charges that were at issue in this trial. But as we know, there's different conduct that is going to be subject to scrutiny in just a couple of weeks in the D.C. trial. So we don't really know what Gates might provide in conjunction with those proceedings.
And Kate, just real quick, you get 8 out of 18 counts. The rest a hung jury. Do prosecutors consider this a win?
I think they do. Look, I'm sure they would have been happy to go, 100%, 18 out of 18, but they got convictions on a lot of counts. So I think that they're probably very pleased with the result.
All right, I want to head back over to Devin Dwyer now. Kate Shaw, thank you so much. I want to head back over to our coordinating producer, Devin Dwyer. Devin, we heard Kate saying, kind of a mixed bag for the prosecution, but she would say a win ultimately. What does that mean politically? Do you think Robert Mueller is declaring victory right now?
Well, I think the special counsel, certainly, as Kate said there, is probably happy with at least some sort of a guilty conviction here in this case. But I've got to say, politically, for the president, this is not good news. And in fact, the Drudge Report, a very popular conservative blog site, just started bannering Trump's Hell Day to give you a sense of how this is playing in that space. And you remember during the 2016 campaign when all of the president's supporters chanted, lock her up, with respect to Hillary Clinton and her alleged crimes. Well, today you started to hear chants of lock him up outside that courthouse just after that verdict was read. And that's something I think you should keep an eye on as the midterm campaign plays out. Democrats, Diane, have seized on this. They see this as a sign of corruption. They're campaigning against corruption. They're pointing out that the president has surrounded himself with some characters now who have run afoul of the law. And politically, this could be a hot issue in just a few weeks when voters head to the polls.
And Devin, the president is getting ready to speak at a rally tonight in West Virginia. Do you expect him to address this?
Well, he might. As you know very well, he has a hard time resisting comment on the top topics of the news. His team was just asked, actually, on Air Force One. They're flying out to Charleston, West Virginia, where he has a rally at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. Sarah Sanders, the press secretary, said she had nothing to comment on right now regarding Paul Manafort or the president's personal lawyer, Michael Cohen, who's in court right now in New York. So no comment officially from the White House. The president heard a question earlier boarding the plane about Manafort. No comment there either. But as we've been talking about, the president has been very fond of Paul Manafort. He's talked about how he thinks that he hasn't been treated fairly, it's been a sad day for the country to see this case go forward, in his view, because of Paul Manafort's connection to the president. And so, it has a lot of people talking about those pardons. You heard Kate mention that's very much on the table. The president hasn't taken those pardons off the table. So it will be worth watching very closely tonight at that rally and in the days ahead how this White House responds and what signal it might send to Paul Manafort and his team.
It will indeed. Devin, thank you. And I actually want to get over to Alex Mallon, who is traveling with the president. And Alex, what do you expect to hear from the president tonight?
Well, I definitely think that at these rallies, whenever it's been in the wake of big news regarding Mueller investigation, Paul Manafort. The president has been mixed. It's basically a test of whether he's going to be restrained, and not to mention these both big bombshell stories that have potential major legal implications for him. But I'll tell you, I've been going around and talking with members of the crowd tonight, mostly before the Manafort news, but after the Michael Cohen news. And most of them just have a hard time separating any of this from what the president on Twitter has called a witch hunt. They largely agree with him here, thinking that it's all part of a deep state looking to him. And I think that it really doesn't matter much to the people. They're here to hear him go on his typical rally talks about immigration, the tax cuts. Really, right now, not a lot of negative reactions, so I can definitely see a lot of people here fidgeting through their smartphones, trying to get a better sense of what this news actually means.
Yeah, there is a lot to dig through for sure. I wonder if he might choose to speak there, given it is seemingly such a positive crowd that will probably work to his benefit.
Yeah, I mean, in the past, we've definitely heard the president, in the wake, actually, I would bring up his rally at the NRA a couple months ago when he was, dealing with they saw initially as positive news out of the Manafort trial, when that judge, T.S. Ellis, was questioning Mueller's mandate. And the President Trump was more than happy to bring it up at that rally. But this, obviously, it's unclear how President Trump might be able to sway this as good news. Certainly in the case of Michael Cohen, there's not a lot of good news you can pull out of there. But perhaps he'll look at that mistrial on those other several counts against Paul Manafort. But we know he spoke glowingly about him just last week on the South Lawn, telling reporters that he's a good man. So potentially that is what we could hear from him tonight. We could just hear the boilerplate witch hunt that we generally hear from him at these rallies. I'm not in the game of predictions right now, but obviously I think there's a lot of anticipation, at least in the press pen here, that we'll hear him address that.
And Alex, given this verdict drops on the same day that the president's personal attorney and former fixer Michael Cohen is seemingly agreeing to a plea deal, what are the political ramifications here for the president, especially going into an election season, hence the campaign rally?
Well, I think that's interesting. I mean, just like I was saying, I've been talking with members of the crowd here. President Trump's going to be here speaking on behalf of Attorney General Patrick Morrisey. This is a deep red state, and they're going to try and unseat Democratic Senator Joe Manchin. And I'll tell you, I hear nothing but a hardened resolve from the members of this crowd. They want to, participate in this war against the deep state, against Democrats that President Trump's been waging on his Twitter and waging with his public remarks. I think that he's going to be able to just enlist them the same way he's done with all his other rallies that he's been holding across the country.
And Alex, stay with me. I just want to kind of recap for anyone who's just joining us. Paul Manafort, who is facing 18 felony counts ranging in bank fraud and tax evasion, has been found guilty on 8 of those counts. Hung jury on the remaining 10. He was the former campaign chair for the Trump campaign. And we're just sort of running through now the political ramifications and legal ramifications of all this. The president is getting ready to speak at a rally in West Virginia tonight. And Alex Malin, who we're speaking to right now, is traveling with the president. Alex, the prosecutors kind of painted this picture of Manafort as someone who made a lot of money consulting pro-Russian politicians and then sort of hid that money in foreign accounts, got used to this opulent lifestyle, and then when the money ran out, resorted to bank fraud and tax evasion in order to continue that opulent lifestyle. The president at first, seemed to sort of stand by Manafort in a way, but then also kind of distance himself from Manafort. Has he changed his tone at all lately as this verdict has come closer and closer?
Well, I think certainly once the first charges were filed against Manafort, we heard the president trying to distance himself, saying, making the claim that Paul Manafort was only on his campaign for a very short period of time. Well, we know that Paul Manafort was actually a member of the president's campaign for 5 months, and he was campaign chairman during that tenure. So, I think that you see the president now shifting to saying he's a good man. It's a shame. Last week, I think what was interesting is that he said it was a shame for our country what Paul Manafort was going through. So I think that there you hear a real appeal to his supporters who sign up to this kind of deep state out to get the president theory that President Trump's own Justice Department is conspiring against him in some way. But at the same time, we've repeatedly heard the president say that whatever Paul Manafort did, it was completely distanced from his campaign and no direct link to any of his crimes and what he was doing while serving as campaign chairman.
Well, we heard this morning again a witch hunt. We heard the president say that he could actually coordinate the Russia investigation himself and essentially do Robert Mueller's job. So we'll see how he weighs in on that today at that rally in West Virginia, if he weighs in on it at all. What else are we expecting to hear from the president at that rally, Alex?
So I think what Republicans will obviously want him to talk about is these Obama-era coal regulations that the president's administration announced that they're rolling back today. It's going to make it easier for coal producers to kind of ignore those previous environmental regulations that were put on by the Obama administration. They're also going to obviously want to hit the greatest hits of any campaign rally, the GOP's tax cuts. They want him to hit on immigration. I spoke to several members of the crowd earlier who really are big on the immigration issue here. They came to just hear the president talk about building the wall and what the progress is with that. I think that they are less interested in the Russia investigation aspect and Michael Cohen and Paul Manafort and all of these legal troubles that are kind of bearing down on the president. And obviously we see him feeling a little bit cornered based on his tweets in the past couple of days. But I think that they really want to hear him lash out now.
All right. Well, we will stand by to hear that, Alex. Thanks so much for being there for us. We look forward to chatting with you a little bit more about that. But right now I want to bring in Mary Ellis Parks, our Deputy Political Director. Mary Ellis, you heard us talking to Alex there as the president gets ready to speak at this rally in West Virginia. Do you think it's advisable for him to address both the Manafort verdict and this potential plea from Cohen?
The president hasn't exactly followed advice from legal experts in the past. I doubt he will begin to do so now. It was pretty surprising to a lot of people in the White House, people in Washington, and obviously legal experts around the country that the president weighed in on the Manafort trial while the jury was deliberating over the last few days. So if he was willing to weigh in then, I can't imagine he goes through an entire speech, an entire freewheeling campaign rally tonight without mentioning it.
What do you think the tone is there? Were they counting on this? Is this a complete surprise?
And no, I don't think this was a surprise. The prosecutors laid out a pretty convincing case, especially on those tax charges. Obviously, you've been talking about all the documentation and the evidence that the government presented. I think a lot of people were expecting some guilty verdicts, and at least on some of those charges, because it seemed like such an extensive paper trail.
And Mary Ellis, if you could stay with me, I just want to bring in Venu Varghese. He's an attorney who's on the phone with us right now to ask him about that, actually. Venu, we saw the prosecution lay out, I think it was presented 27 witnesses, pieces of evidence, etc. The defense's tactic here seemed to just be, well, they didn't prove their case. Legal experts have said that's not unusual, but given the results, do you think that that was not the correct strategy here?
I'm not sure there was any strategy that would have been the one correct strategy in this case. I think the defense did the best it could with the circumstances. They couldn't put on a case. I didn't see any chance for them to put on a case. And what they did was they attacked. And look, there were 10 counts that the jury came back with no verdict on. So they can take some small solace in that. But unfortunately, the counts that he was convicted upon will carry significant jail time.
And one of the big questions people wanted to know was, would Manafort take the stand, which of course he didn't. What goes into that kind of decision-making as an attorney?
Look, you can't, as an attorney, put a client on who's going to lie. So I imagine the tack that they took was this was a reasonable doubt case, that the government didn't prove its case. I think with the evidence that they put forward on filing false tax returns.
All right, we are
Now reporting, George Stephanopoulos.
Good afternoon. We are coming on the air again because Michael Cohen, President Trump's former attorney, has just left the courthouse in the Southern District of New York in Lower Manhattan after pleading guilty to charges of tax evasion, bank fraud, and most significantly, campaign finance violations. He's facing years in prison. He will be released on $500,000 bond, but will also have to contribute about $500,000, forfeit $500,000 to the government, facing very serious charges. Unclear going forward. This is not a cooperation agreement, but unclear going forward what kind of cooperation he may give to the special counsel Robert Mueller or others investigating the president. We're about to hear shortly from the deputy U.S. attorney prosecuting this case, Robert Khuzami. But I want to bring in Tom Yamas first because, Tom, this is very significant. These two campaign finance violations that Cohen is pleading guilty to, connected to the payments to Karen McDougal, alleged to have an affair with President Trump back in the 2016 campaign, also to Stormy Daniels, the porn star, alleged to have an affair with President Trump. He is saying, Michael Cohen, he said it in open court, that he made these payments, these illegal payments, in coordination and at the direction of the candidate for President of the United States.
George, that's the bombshell right there. That's the headline out of this proceeding, that he did this, quote, at the direction of the candidate. And this is both with Karen McDougal and, as you mentioned, Stormy Daniels as well, with and at the direction of the same candidate. Of course, talking there about President Trump. A wild scene outside of court just now. Michael Cohen just left as people were screaming at him at the top of their lungs, lock him up, cursing at him as he got into his vehicle. A little bit of color from inside court. Michael Cohen walked in. He came in through a side entrance. He was protected, if you will, by the police and the FBI as he came in. Got inside. He was wearing a dark suit, a yellow tie. He winked at one reporter. He was asked at one point, since he was pleading guilty, if he was under any medication, if by any chance he was intoxicated. He said only that he had a drink last night, a 12-year Glenlivet, and that's usually not what he does. But it gives you a sense of what was going through his head. He's 4 days from his 52nd birthday, so definitely a rough week for him. And the max he could face right now, according to what we learned inside, could be 65 years. That's the maximum prison time. We know at this point sentencing is December 12th, but he did walk out on a $500,000 bond.
And again,
George?
There was no mention of a cooperation agreement inside that courthouse, but that doesn't preclude his cooperation, perhaps, with investigators going forward.
That's an incredibly important point, George. You're right. There is no cooperation. He doesn't have to cooperate with federal authorities, but the plea deal doesn't prevent him from doing that in the future, so that very well could happen.
Okay, again, he's been pleading guilty to 8 counts of campaign finance violations, tax evasion, and bank fraud. I want to bring in our chief legal analyst, Dan Abrams, for more on this. Facing some counts having to do with his personal business there, but Dan, the real news here, those campaign finance pleas, illegal corporate contribution, excessive campaign contribution at the direction of the candidate for president.
Well, that's right. You have to separate it out, because the ones with regard to tax fraud and bank fraud, that's related to him personally. That's a very different issue than when he's saying, I was directed to do something by the person that's clearly President Donald Trump. So in any other environment, we'd be saying, well, the next person to be charged here likely could be Donald Trump. But because, as we've talked about many times before, it is unlikely that the special counsel or anyone will seek to indict a sitting president, he could become a sort of unindicted co-conspirator. But regardless, Michael Cohen is making it very clear that he was directed to do this by the president, which actually makes the president's culpability here, if it's true, more significant than Michael Cohen, who's simply saying, I executed on his order.
And I want to bring in Chris Christie as well, another former prosecutor. Chris, the question there would be, what kind of documents or other evidence would the prosecutors be able to show to back up that contention from Michael Cohen? Apparently, we don't have Chris Christie right now. Let me go to Cecilia Vega at the White House. Cecilia, these claims from Michael Cohen, as he's pleading guilty to campaign finance violations, run right in the face of persistent denials we saw from the White House, from President Trump's aides, of any knowledge of anything having to do with the payments to Stormy Daniels or Karen McDougal, at least initially.
Exactly. And the explanations were and have been head spinning, from the campaign to the White House to the Trump legal team. And really, this is what put this administration facing smack in the middle of a crisis of credibility, George. Initially, Michael Cohen had said that this money came from his personal funds. Then we all remember that scene on Air Force One where the president denied knowing anything about the payments to Stormy Daniels. And then it just sort of spiraled out of control from there, where Rudy Giuliani, the president's lawyer, admitted that the president, in fact, fact, did use this money from his personal account to pay Michael Cohen, but he said it was to stop what he called false and extortionist accusations, essentially to save his marriage, not because he was admitting any wrongdoing in these claims. That was for the Stormy Daniels case. The president ultimately did on Twitter acknowledge knowing about the payment, that the money came from his own account to Michael Cohen, and he says that this was something that was very common for rich people and celebrities to do. On the Karen McDougal case, there have been blanket denials from the very beginning of this campaign, where Hope Hicks, back then his longtime aide, denied the president doing anything wrong, knowing anything about these payments, and denying blanket denials about an affair. Giuliani just last month denied the president knowing anything about this transaction.
Cecilia, hold on a second, because we are now seeing Robert Khuzami, the deputy U.S. attorney here in New York, who's prosecuting this case.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Robert Khuzami. I'm the deputy United States attorney for the Southern District of New York and the attorney for the United States in this matter. With me is Bill Sweeney, assistant director in charge of the New York field office of the FBI, and James Robnett, who is the supervisory agent in charge of the New York office of the IRS. Also with me are the prosecutors from the United States Attorney's Office in the Southern District of New York who prosecuted the Cohen matter. I'm going to have a brief statement and will not be taking any questions. Today, as you heard, Michael Cohen pled guilty to 8 felony charges. 5 of those dealt with tax evasion for the years 2012 through 2016, in which he failed to report approximately $4.1 million in reported income. Approximately 2.5 of that money was from interest payments from a personal loan that he failed to report. Approximately $1.3 million of that money was from the operation of his taxi medallion business. Approximately $100,000 of that money was from brokerage commissions, and over $200,000 was from consulting fees. That's over $4.3 million over a 5-year period, which translates into a loss to the United States Treasury of approximately $1.3 million. In addition, in count 6, Mr. Cohen pled guilty to making false statements to a financial institution in connection with an application for a home equity line of credit. In that application, he failed to disclose more than $14 million in debt that he had, and as a result of that concealment, he obtained that $500,000 line of credit, which he would not have been entitled to had he been candid and honest. In addition, Mr. Cohen pled guilty to 2 campaign finance charges, one for causing an unlawful corporate contribution, and a second one for personally making an excessive personal contribution, both for the purpose of influencing the 2016 election. In addition, what he did was he worked to pay money to silence 2 women who had information that he believed would be detrimental to the 2016 campaign and to the candidate and the campaign. In addition, Mr. Cohen sought reimbursement for that money by submitting invoices to the candidate's company, which were untrue and false. They indicated that the reimbursement was for services rendered for the year 2017, when in fact those invoices were a sham. He provided no legal services for the year 2017, and it was simply a means to obtain reimbursement for the unlawful campaign contribution. A couple of points I'd like to make. First, these are very serious charges and reflect a pattern of lies and dishonesty over an extended period of time. They are significant in their own rights. They are particularly significant when done by a lawyer who, through training and tradition, understands what it means to be a lawyer, to engage in honest and fair dealing and adherence to the law. Mr. Cohen disregarded that training, disregarded that tradition, and decided that he was above the law, and for that he was going to pay a very, very serious price. With respect to the campaign finance violations, the campaign finance laws are designed to prevent the use of illegal money in elections and to maintain the integrity of those elections. Mr. Cohen made guilty pleas for those campaign violations, and those are core violations. And what he did was these pleas remind us that it is illegal for corporations to make contributions to candidates, and it is illegal to make contributions in excess of the amount that Congress set for individuals. That is a strong message today, and we will not fear of prosecuting additional campaign finance cases. Lastly, and perhaps most importantly, this case is unique in many ways. Just witness the gathering of all of you here today. And in other ways, it's unique as well. But in the really important ways, this case is not unlike many cases that my office, the United States Attorney's Office, brings, that the entire Department of Justice brings, and that the law enforcement agencies do as well, including the FBI and the IRS. This case has more in common with all those cases because they all share the same message. And that message is that the rule of law applies, and that for law enforcement, all of whom are gathered here, it is our commitment that we will pursue and vindicate those who choose to break the law, and vindicate the majority of people who live law-abiding lives, who follow honest and fair dealing, and live lives of lawful behavior. The message is that we are here, prosecutors are here, law enforcement is here, the Department of Justice is here, the law enforcement agencies here. We are a nation of laws, and the essence of this case is justice, and that is an equal playing field for all persons in the eyes of the law, and that is a lesson that Mr. Cohen learned today, and it is a very harsh one for him. Thank you very much.
Ringing statement there from Robert Khuzami, the Deputy U.S. Attorney. Let's hear it. Hold on.
I'm sorry. I'd also like to introduce, my fault. I really want to thank Mr. Sweeney and James Robnett of the FBI and the IRS and the agents who work for them. We do many, many cases with them, and their determination and their fair dealing and their vigor with which they pursue their cases is really inspirational. To the prosecutors in my office, I cannot express the gratitude for the hard work that they did in this case, and that is Assistant United States Attorneys Andrea Griswold and Nick Roos and Rachel Maiman and Tom McKay, as well as Ed Discant, the Deputy Chief of the Public Corruption Unit, and Russell Capone, the Chief of the Public Corruption Unit. For all of these people, I could go on and on about their many virtues and talents, but the one important thing is they all are satisfied with simply being known as public servants, prosecutors, and law enforcement agents who are doing their job. Thank you very much.
Robert Khuzami, Deputy U.S. Attorney, with a ringing statement there about the rule of law. I want to bring in a man who stood in those shoes as well. Chris Christie, a former U.S. Attorney in New Jersey as well, of course, also former governor of New Jersey. He said, Chris, that this case is unique in some ways, but not unlike so many other cases that U.S. attorneys face every single day, and it's sending the message the rule of law must stand. And as he said, a very harsh message today for Michael Cohen.
Well, a really harsh message, George. And he's right that the U.S. attorneys' offices across the country are doing cases like this every day. But he also noted that the presence of the media is there because this involves now, Michael Cohen has said publicly, that he was directed to do these things by then candidate Donald Trump, now President Trump. And so this is now going to come down to a credibility argument, George, and what things they have to prove that the president did in fact direct.
Well, that's what I wanted to ask you about, because we know that the special master and others have gone through thousands, hundreds of thousands of documents here, more than 1 million documents. We know that there is this is not a cooperation agreement, yet we've also seen this bombshell charge from Michael Cohen and an admission at the court saying he did this at the direction of the president. What does that mean for President Trump right now?
Well, listen, one, we know that this is not a normal circumstance because I think most people, legal experts, will agree that the president himself can't be indicted, that any kind of charges in that regard would have to be handled by Congress. But what I'd also say is that, now we understand perhaps why Michael Cohen and his folks were putting out that tape of he and then candidate Trump talking about the setting up of some type of mechanism to pay Stormy Daniels, and maybe now what the significance of that tape may be in Michael Cohen's mind. I'm sure we'll hear a different story from the president in the White House, but I think that tape now becomes, and whether there are any other tapes, becomes kind of significant.
And you
George.
mentioned this is a credibility case at this point. Isn't the president's case hurt by the fact that prior to this he had denied any knowledge of those payments and then was forced to admit that he knew about them?
Certainly, George. Every time that he's found to not having told the complete truth, the unvarnished truth about something, that's something that any group of folks in the position of deciding the facts of a case, are going to look at and say that's a factor to be considered. In the end, though, it's very interesting that Michael Cohen's not cooperating here, and this is a non-cooperating plea agreement. He looks at a huge sentence here potentially, and he's looking at some significant crimes, much more significant crimes in terms of monetary amount, George, on the stuff that was his own personal conduct than what we're talking about in terms of the campaign finance violations. Then those are the ones that are going to really drive his sentence.
Right, but that's what will drive the sentence. Final question to Dan Abrams, our chief legal analyst, as well. One of the open questions, I suppose, if both you and Chris Christie agree that it's unlikely, if not, that a president would be indicted, would not be indicted. The question is now, will this information go back to Robert Mueller, the information having to do with President Trump?
Oh, there's no question that it will. And the question you have to ask yourself is, if Cohen isn't telling the truth, why would he make this up? Why would he implicate himself in a crime that's going to add years to his sentence? It just doesn't make any sense if there's no cooperation agreement that he's sort of getting this enormous benefit by coming clean about. What is he getting from this? And I think that adds to the credibility of Cohen's plea here and of the truth as to what happened, because there doesn't seem to me to be a logical argument on the other side, apart from what I'm sure President Trump and Rudy Giuliani will say is he's just not telling the truth. He did this on his own. He's trying to blame President Trump for it. This was something that he, but the problem with that is you add that to the public statements that have now been made by Giuliani and Trump conceding the payments. And you're in a difficult position here with regard to credibility.
And I want to bring back our senior justice correspondent, Pierre Thomas, as well. Pierre, this was given over, as I said, from Robert Mueller to the Southern District of New York, notoriously independent district. But they did report this back to the Justice Department before bringing Michael Cohen into court today. And this is something that Rod Rosenstein, who's now leading the entire investigation, was informed of.
Absolutely, George. Mueller was aware of all this that's going on. But one very important point here, this case is not potentially over because the charges mentioned that Cohen coordinated with other campaign officials. Those people are likely going to get a call from the FBI, a visit from the FBI. They will want to know what they know about this. They will seek additional corroboration. So this is potentially far from over,
That is a critical point. Not only that he acted at the direction of the president, but also that he coordinated with other members of the campaign, unnamed members of the campaign. Finally, I want to go to Cecilia Vega at the White House. We did not hear from the president before he headed to Charleston, West Virginia. As he was leaving the White House, no doubt he'll speak out on this tonight.
Certainly no doubt about that, George. This has not been a good day for this president, for this White House. On the same day that his personal attorney pleaded guilty, his campaign manager was found guilty, and perhaps the conservative website, the headline on Drudge right now says it all, George, Trump's hell hour. That's how this is being described.
Charges against his former campaign chair, against his former personal attorney, both. Paul Manafort convicted today on 8 charges of tax evasion and bank fraud. Michael Cohen pleading guilty today on charges of bank fraud and tax evasion and campaign finance violations connected to the 2016 presidential campaign. We're going to have a full wrap-up tonight on World News Tonight with David Muir, and I'll see you tomorrow on GMA.
And we're going to continue this special report here on ABC News Live. We want to bring in political director Rick Klein to talk again about Michael Cohen, the president's former personal attorney and fixer, pleading guilty now to 8 counts of campaign finance violation, tax evasion, and bank fraud. Rick, it sounds like the big focus politically is this campaign finance violations. The other counts seem to be more personal and what Cohen was doing with his finance. But the campaign finance violations seem to potentially tie in the president actually, because Cohen is saying Trump directed me to do these things. And not just that, but the part of the deal also says that one or more campaign officials worked with him on the Stormy Daniels deal, for example. So what does this all mean politically for the administration and the White House?
That is the key point. This is going to get bigger before it gets smaller, because once you start implicating the President of the United States, campaign officials, that suggests that we're closer to the beginning than the end of the story when it regards Michael Cohen. Even though he is pleading guilty to these charges and he hasn't signed any kind of a cooperating agreement, this information alone leads in all sorts of different directions. And it's telling that it has come home to roost, that you've had this moment where it has all come to account, because it does suggest that wherever things go with Robert Mueller, this is a separate probe. These answers are going to have to be made. And if it comes down to being a credibility question, as Governor Christie just suggested, President Trump in a very difficult spot given the now sworn testimony in this guilty plea from his former chief attorney, the guy that held the keys to the Trump kingdom for a long time.
And Mary Ellis Parks, our deputy political director, is also with us. And Mary Ellis, you know, this coming down just after we learned that Paul Manafort, Trump's former campaign chair, also has been found guilty on 8 criminal counts. What does this mean for the White House? And with the president about to speak at this rally, how do you position this politically if you're him?
On the one hand, the Mueller convictions the Mueller convictions in the Manafort trial speak to really Robert Mueller's work. There's the first salvo in what the special counsel has been doing, and really a win, maybe a partial, but a win for the special counsel, and proof that they're going to keep going forward. On the other hand, the Cohen story gets to the president's own legal challenges. Really a difference there. Not just what the special counsel is doing, but what the president might be implicated in is now directly implicated from Cohen's perspective in. And so we're talking about 2 totally separate cases with the president in the middle. And I keep coming back to the fact that we are still just under 3 weeks away from the midterms, where everything here in D.C. could change, because anything that would revolve around indicting the president, charging the president, getting a testimony from the president will be political questions that could really be decided on Capitol Hill. And if Democrats take the House, if Democrats suddenly have chairmanships and can subpoena more members of the White House, we're going to see this go to a totally new level.
And Rick, on that point, you know, heading into the election season, the president's reaction to this is incredibly important right now, and he has been nothing but unpredictable. Sometimes he keeps quiet and makes no comment. Other times he comes out swinging. What do you expect to see tonight, and what do you think his strategy will be going into these midterms?
I expect him to point out about today's news that the special counsel struck out on 10 of the 18 charges. Not a great batting average if you're spinning it from his perspective. Of course, Manafort faces many years in prison. The Cohen news, he has already effectively sidelined Michael Cohen, questioned his loyalty, questioned his practices throughout. I don't know that he's likely to attack him tonight. We'll see at this campaign event. Look, these campaign events have been a lot more about President Trump than they've been about the candidates he's out to represent. But it has been a mind-boggling couple of hours that just gets capped up with a rally. And look, I'll tell you, in terms of Trump supporters, you're starting to see it from reports of reporters in the room already. It's not like the Trump base is going to give up on him because of this. I'd imagine this is going to be met with a collective shrug from that crowd there in West Virginia. They're not going to really care about this news. But it does take a broader political toll across the country as this continues to unfold, and because we know that this continues to head in very uncomfortable directions for President Trump.
Quite an eventful couple of hours is right. Rick Klein, our political director in D.C. Thank you, Rick. So again, to recap for you, President Trump's former campaign chair, Paul Manafort, has been found guilty on 8 counts of tax fraud and bank fraud, or tax evasion and bank fraud, I should say. And now we're learning that the president's former attorney and fixer, Michael Cohen, has just pled guilty to 8 counts of tax evasion, bank fraud, and campaign finance violations. Those last set, the campaign finance violations, could actually tie back to not just the president, but other campaign officials. So more to come on this, all as the president himself is getting ready to speak at a rally in West Virginia. We, of course, will have the latest on all of that for you. For now, we are signing off at ABC News Live, but don't forget to check abcnews.com and your ABC News app for the latest on all of these developments as they continue to come out. Thanks so much for watching, everyone. Have a great night.